Reaganomics, otherwise known as the brainchild of the so-called greatest economists in American history. Those like Alan Greenspan, Don Reagan, Ronald Reagan, and Milton Friedman. The economic system was revolutionary. It would bring incalculable increases in national wealth, and everyone would be better off, not just a select social class. Money would be growing on trees. All America had to do in supporting this fiscal policy was to reduce government spending, give tax cuts to the rich, and supplement big business by reducing regulation. In doing so, those affiliated with big business would have that incentive to spend the extra money they would retain on their workers, on technology, on research, and on equipment. Internal improvements would be abundant, and would be better off with an economic system that eradicated the need for unions and the minimum wage. The true supply side of the market would stabilize, and America would prosper. But there was just one catch. It didn't work. This momentous trickle-down theory, the apex of pro-business scheming, kicked America's ass. CEO wages skyrocketed, and the gap between rich and poor, forget about reducing it. The distribution of wealth was redefined. A never-before-seen gap emerged between the rich and the poor. The rich got richer, while the poor got poorer. That became the new norm. The fabric of the free market was exterminated. Competition decreased. Sure, productivity increased, but only because those who didn't get laid off had to work twice as hard. And the numbers in control of our nation's power and wealth, they decreased too. But those at the top, they didn't care. They were willing to sacrifice the overall welfare of the American people for their own personal short-term gratification. And the words of our founding fathers about not allowing American power and wealth to be controlled by the few, we can forget about those too. The trickling down never happened. Why would the rich want to spend more money on the American people when they can just use the money to exploit overseas workers? They created foreign manufacturing plants in places like China, India, and Indonesia, paying workers one-tenth of what they paid domestic American workers. Reaganomics intertwined private enterprise with government. This co-opting had the immediate consequence of initiating a 30-year alliance between big business and federal government, in which business regulation was shirked. The basis of our free market was compromised, our national debt skyrocketed, and the rich inherited both the power and the wealth of America, making the American dream become the American nightmare. Ronald Reagan began his public career as a sports broadcaster, not as a politician. As his line of work picked up, Reagan elected to join the movie industry, succeeding immediately in B movies. His good-natured personality shone in movies he starred in, as he became a national icon. King's Row, Desperate Journey, and This Is the Army featured Reagan at his finest, and common Americans soon linked Reagan's name with Hollywood. But common Americans were not the only ones who found Ronald Reagan appealing. The GOP, looking for a candidate to combat the Democratic giants of JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Jimmy Carter, found Reagan to be exceptionally appealing. And here was another plus. Americans already loved him for his big-screen performances. And so, the presidency of 1980 was guaranteed to the Republicans. Reagan was swept into the presidency, with the American public ensuing that he won in a landslide. Then began his mass redistribution of wealth. America was in desperate need of economic aid. The recession of the early 1980s saw rising inflation and rising unemployment. And who better to save the day than Ronald Reagan? Epitomizing conservative ideals, his Reaganomics took effect. Only the whole theory that the poor would prosper because government money would trickle down to them didn't work. Aid went to Reagan's buddies, like Don Reagan, chairman of Merrill Lynch and soon-to-be chief of staff. The tax cuts that the rich wanted were also enacted. And business regulation, you can forget about it. Unregulated business was the name of the game. Now even more money flowed in the hands of the few. Helping Americans was never in Ronald Reagan's picture. What was in the picture was helping his big business buddies grow richer. And this began by attempting to cut minimum wage and reduce employment. For example, let's say that a business, Dominic's, has $8 to spend on employment. Let's say that they're also looking to hire 4 brothers, and current minimum wage is $2.90. In this case, Dominic's would only be able to hire 2 of the brothers. But let's eradicate the minimum wage. Dominic's could now hire all 4 for $2 apiece. Now every brother is employed, and Dominic's had more employees than it would have had with that minimum wage of $2.90. Not a bad deal, huh? But wait, let's go back to a period where this system was utilized. Pre-Civil War South. Reagan's system would make perfect economic sense here. But were slaves happy? They were all employed, weren't they? But would a slave prefer to work for virtually nothing or for $2 an hour? In Reagan's mind, the slave would prefer to work for virtually nothing, and one of the brothers, he would prefer to work for $2 instead of $2.90. How much sense does that make? Now, 70% taxes in the early years before Ronald Reagan were cut to 28% by the end of the Reagan administration. Rather than putting their money into jobs, research, or equipment, Reagan's big businesses went on the largest merger binge in history, slicing down competition by buying up smaller companies. Fewer hands were given more control of the economy. Multi-billion-dollar corporate war chests were assembled to finance takeovers of large companies such as oil and coal, and communication giants and prestigious financial institutions were also taken over. As a result, in 1980, the top 1% of Americans earned $110,000 a year. But 10 years later, the same top 1% earned 80% more, approximately $200,000 a year. And the remaining Americans' earnings? Well, in that same period, the average American's income was $21,300. It grew a whopping 3% to $21,700. And what about the poorest Americans now? Well, they actually saw their incomes decrease by 4%. And in 1989, after Reaganomics had taken effect, Congress reported that data suggested that only the richest were beneficiaries of Reaganomics, while everyone else was still waiting for this whole trickling down to take effect. And now we bring the L curve into play. Let's take the United States income distribution and display it horizontally on a football field, with the poorest on the left and the richest on the right. The vertical part of the graph is the height of an income in terms of $100 bills. Now the 5-yard line represents those who have virtually nothing, perhaps $1 or $200 bills. The 50-yard line represents the average income, approximately $40,000 and approximately 1.5 inches high. The 95-yard line represents an income of $100,000 and 4 inches high of $100 bills. Now at the 99-yard line, we have the millionaires, with stacks of $100 bills 40 inches high. Now go even farther to the right. We have our billionaires, with a stack of $100 bills 1 kilometer high. Finally, you have your multi-billionaires, with stacks surpassing Mount Everest and even our own stratosphere. Thus, we have the distribution of wealth, a giant backwards L, and the largest gap between rich and poor since 1947. We must now thank Ronald Reagan and Reaganomics for allowing us to live the American dream. We thank you, Ronald Reagan, for allowing our deregulated businesses to create unprecedented income gaps between rich and poor, for allowing our nation to fall into a grave $14 trillion national debt with your reduction of taxes and your extensive borrowing, and for allowing big business the liberty of controlling not only our economic policies, but the political policies behind our democracy, and for allowing our new masters to make slaves of us all.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear, that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think a communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us.
Well,
I don't even trust you to do that.